One day, a girl writes a letter expressing how she will never change or grow, tired of her existence. She leaves her home to watch the sunrise, and as she looks up, we see her yellow eyes. We soon realize she is a vampire, as her body instantly burns up with the sunrise. The world is shown to be empty during the day. Due to a plague caused by an infected bat in 2009, most of humanity has become vampiric. The human population is plummeting, and researchers are searching for blood substitutes to sustain the vampire population while a small group fights for human rights, as humans are being hunted and farmed for sustenance. When night falls, the world comes to life again. We see vampires leading their normal lives, similar to how humans used to, going out or heading to work. There's even a homeless vampire begging for blood, threatening a random citizen, leading to the police electrocuting him. Meanwhile, we follow the protagonist, Edward Dalton, as he drives and then takes the subway to work. He works as a hematologist for Bromley Marks, a pharmaceutical company and a major blood supplier. After passing through security at the building entrance, Edward walks past the reservoirs with machines farming humans, a place he hates, before reaching the lab. He is trying to find a blood substitute, but his latest attempt has also failed. Later, he has a meeting with his boss, Charles Bromley, his lab partner, Christopher Caruso, a commissioner, and an army officer. The commissioner informs them about the results of an experiment conducted on a death row vampire, selected for a study on the effects of blood deprivation. The lack of blood caused complete degeneration of the frontal lobe, first evidenced by his ears growing longer. He quickly deteriorated into an Nosferatu-like creature, a character from a classic 1920s vampire film, devoid of rationality or emotions. These creatures are called subspecies and are becoming a problem on the streets. Only 5% of the human population remains, and if a substitute is not found soon, they will all turn into this subspecies. Bromley interrupts the meeting and takes Edward to his office for a private meeting, where he dismisses the blood coffee served while sharing his story. He discovered he had terminal cancer before the epidemic, but vampirism cured him. He adds that his daughter refused to become a vampire and ran away. He knows Edward sympathizes with humans, as does he, which is why they need to start tests as soon as possible to save the human race. Edward returns to his lab and discusses this with Christopher, who suggests the substitute is showing promising results in animals, and it's time to test on vampires. Soon after, the researchers start the test while Bromley and some police officers watch from a window. Edward slowly injects the substitute into a soldier's body, who initially feels fine, but after the full dose is administered, he vomits, convulses, and large bubbles appear all over his body. The researchers quickly move to restrain him and inject another product to stop the convulsions and the bubbles, but a second later, his entire body explodes. Later that night, Edward leaves the office and drives home. He watches the news in his car, which reports on disturbances related to blood rationing schemes. When he scratches his ear and notices something wrong, he opens the camera mirror and realizes his ears are starting to grow. This distraction means he doesn't see a car coming from the opposite direction. He barely manages to swerve at the last second and stop his vehicle, but the other car crashes into a fence. Edward goes out to help and is shot in the arm when he sees that the people getting out of the other car are humans and their leader, Audrey Bennett, has a crossbow to defend herself from vampires. Suddenly, police cars can be heard approaching, so Edward swears he only wants to help and urges the humans into his car, which they accept after some hesitation. Edward activates the car's daytime protection driving mode, which turns all the windows black, then removes the arrow from his arm before the police arrive. He lies to the police about which direction the humans ran, while Audrey finds Edward's ID badge and discovers his job. After the police leave, the humans exit the car and flee. But before, Audrey congratulates Edward on his birthday. Moments later, Edward is arriving home, where a community announcement is warning everyone of the sunrise in an hour. As soon as he gets home, he has dinner and starts tending to his plants when suddenly his brother Frankie Dalton visits, who he hasn't seen for months due to joining the army. Frankie comments on the lack of a birthday party for him, to which Edward responds that he has already turned 35 10 times, but Frankie doesn't care. He thinks they should celebrate, and for that, he brought an expensive bottle of 100% pure human blood. He serves 2 glasses while teasing his brother for drinking pig blood, but Edward adamantly refuses to drink human blood. This infuriates Frankie, who starts an old argument of theirs. Frankie condemns Edward for not touching human blood but still working for a company that cultivates people, which Edward sees as a necessary evil to find the substitute, but he also condemns Frankie for hunting humans for the army. Edward suddenly grabs the bottle of blood and starts pouring it down the sink, but Frankie snatches it back from him and throws it against the wall and heads for the exit. However, a subspecies creature appears and blocks his way. The creature enters the kitchen and begins to lick the blood from the walls and then the glass on the table. Frankie grabs a knife from the stand which scares the monster, making it attack and throw him away against the wall. He falls on a glass table and loses consciousness for a few seconds. The creature moves towards Edward next, and he keeps it at bay with a stool while calling his brother's name. Frankie wakes up and retrieves the knife. Together they try to attack the creature, but it jumps and hangs from the ceiling. This allows Frankie to cut it a few times and then decapitate it, thus killing it. Moments later, the police arrive to investigate the case, commenting on the fact that this subspecies is now attacking in the suburbs. One of the officers finds a ring on the creature that makes Edward realize that it was his local gardener, also finds self-inflicted wounds, making him conclude that feeding on oneself accelerates mutation. The next morning, Edward is awakened by a security alert. He goes to check and, upon turning on the lights, finds Audrey pointing a crossbow at him. She tells him that they are looking for vampires they can trust and that they need his help to find another way beyond the substitute. Then she gives him a sheet of paper with a map. Edward is suddenly distracted by a noise and turns around, allowing Audrey to silently leave. When he checks the noise, he discovers it's Frankie, who asks Edward who the woman was. Edward then replies saying it was nobody. Later, the news shows that investors are withdrawing their human supplies from the Bromley's Marks Collection Center. Edward goes to work and meets with his boss to ask for assurance that the substitute will really be used to replace the need for human supply. Bromley replies that most of the population will be happy with this, but a small sector will always demand the real thing. Edward reminds him that this would also include his daughter. Upon returning to his laboratory, he looks at the map Audrey gave him. When morning comes, Edward does not return home. He puts the light protection on the car and follows the map to the countryside, where Audrey was already waiting for him. He parks under the shade of that tree and, after putting on a hat and sunglasses, he gets out of the car. Always careful not to step into the light, then he approaches an old man named Lionel Cormack. He says he used to be a vampire, but now he is human again. Edward wants to know how, but they are interrupted by Audrey approaching, under the gunpoint aimed at her by Frankie. Edward tries to stop him, but Frankie doesn't want to listen, and army reinforcements were already arriving. Audrey pushes Frankie into the sunlight and tries to escape with Lionel, but the soldiers open fire and destroy their vehicle. Then they flee in Edward's car. They are pursued and shot at as they drive away, creating several holes in the car's dark window protection. At first, Audrey manages to cover them with her hands, but the shots keep making more and more holes. The camera is also hit, so Edward can't see ahead anymore. Lionel takes the wheel so he can see the road through a hole and Edward can hide from the light. When they reach an old bridge, Lionel drives as fast as he can to cross it. They barely make it, but the heavy military truck doesn't, and the bridge collapses underneath it, causing an explosion. The other military trucks are left behind, with no way to follow. After night falls, they park near a river, and Lionel shares his story with Edward. He used to work on daylight modifications for cars and had one of the first shops in town. He adds that driving during the day was amazing because there were no other people around. but it could also be very dangerous for the driver if they accidentally exposed themselves to sunlight. That's what happened to Lionel. He wasn't feeling well because he hadn't fed, so he accidentally crashed his car against the river fence. The crash ejected him from the car, and he caught fire in the air before falling into the river, and when he emerged from the water, he was human again. Lionel and Audrey want Edward to safely recreate these conditions, so all vampires can become human again. Back at the company, Bromley is looking at photos of his daughter when Frankie comes to see him. Bromley congratulates him for reporting what happened and says if Edward returns immediately, no formal charges will be made. Frankie agrees to do whatever Bromley asks. Meanwhile, Edward and the humans are back in their car, driving to their hideout. Edward can't stop looking at Audrey's neck. When she notices this and sees his pointed ears, she cuts her hand and pours some of her blood into a cup for him to drink. He immediately refuses, but Audrey says she doesn't want to worry about him attacking anyone when they arrive at their destination, so he accepts the cup and drinks. A few hours later, they arrive at an old vineyard, where Edward meets other humans, including Jarvis, leading a rescue group to find more humans. After entering the house, he also meets Senator Wes Turner, a vampire politician in favor of protecting human rights and finding a cure. The scene briefly cuts to Bromley watching as one of his machines loses all its humans and his researchers removing a body. Then we see a coffee stand at the subway station, where a man complains that his coffee doesn't have enough blood. The clerk tells him that 5% is as much as she can serve, but the man doesn't take no for an answer and steals a blood bag which, when broken, splashes everyone around him, sending them into a frenzied frenzy. Then people revolt and attack the coffee stand to steal more blood, causing the police to arrive to electrocute them and subdue them while the employees also frantically drink the blood inside the stand, showing the level of degradation the vampires are reaching due to the scarcity of blood. The next morning, at the vineyard, Edward takes some blood from Lionel to do some tests while asking him how he felt on the day he became human again. Edward thinks maybe the only way to treat the blood is while it's still inside the body and controlling the combustion from sunlight. A few hours later, when he leaves the lab to take a break, most of the humans shy away from him. Audrey comes up and says they may fear him, but they still think he can help them. Edward confesses that he didn't want to transform, but Frankie betrayed him and transformed him anyway. At that moment Edward notices the fermentation tanks, and after Audrey confirms that they are airtight, they look at them from inside. The tanks have air extractors that would allow them to extinguish the fire, and Edward decides to use them in his experiments, so they start working on the necessary modifications. Later in the middle of the night, we see Jarvis's group on the road in a convoy of rescued humans to the vineyard, including Bromley's daughter, Allison. When suddenly a shot pierces the tire and they are forced to stop the cars. They come out with their guns ready, but the army was surrounding them, and after a short exchange of gunfire, all the humans are sedated and captured. Allison manages to contact the vineyard but also falls unconscious. Then when Frankie takes the walkie-talkie from her hands and uses it to track the call and find the location of the vineyard. At the vineyard, all the humans are gathering their things and getting into their cars, ready to follow Turner to his hideout. But Edward wants to stay there because there won't be another chance to recreate the experiment, so Lionel and Audrey decide to stay with him and help him. Back at the Bromley company, Allison wakes up in her father's office and grabs a knife as he comes to see her. Allison pleads for the lives of her friends, but Bromley says he's happy to see her and, while hugging her, states he can't do anything for her friends. Allison pushes him away and runs for the door when Bromley realizes his daughter has stabbed him. Then Frankie appears and knocks her out. When morning arrives at the vineyard, the experiment is ready to begin. Audrey watches the monitors while Lionel is in the tank with Edward, who is connected to a heart monitor and covered by a wet blanket. The process is simple. They open the hole in the tank's roof to let sunlight in and burn Edward, then use the air extractor to extinguish the fire. The first two attempts are a failure, but they keep Edward warm for longer on the third attempt, and this time it works. When the heart monitor shows the first steady pulses happen and Edward manages to become human again. However, their joy is interrupted by the army arriving to invade the place, but they avoid capture by hiding in a wine barrel. Cutting back to the company, Frankie visits Bromley, who is being treated for his wound. He asks Frankie to do something for him, and Frankie leaves the room to see Allison in her cell. He is there to turn her into a vampire as well, but she vehemently refuses, so Frankie goes ahead and bites her anyway. Back at the vineyard, the trio leaves their hiding place after ensuring it's safe to come out. Edward steps out and is amazed by the sunlight touching his skin without burning, while Lionel retrieves an old car of his. At the company, Bromley sees how all his machines are now empty and then goes to check on his daughter, who isn't drinking her blood ration. He enters the cell and discovers she is self-mutilating, which would turn her into a mutation. She attacks her father, blaming him for everything while being led away by a soldier. After the military imposes martial law to freely fight against the subspecies in the streets, we cut to Edward, Audrey, and Lionel arriving at Turner's cabin, only to find all the humans dead. Audrey starts to lose hope, but Edward says he knows someone who can help. After briefly cutting to Christopher getting a break in the lab, we see the military dragging subspecies mutations into the sunlight for execution. Allison is among them, and witnessing her death makes Frankie reconsider his position. Later that night, Christopher returns home to find the trio waiting for him. Edward tells him he has the cure, which is much better than a substitute, and asks for his help to recreate the experiment. Their conversation is interrupted by a phone call, so Christopher excuses himself and leaves the room to answer it, claiming it's trouble with his ex-wife. When he takes too long to return, they become suspicious, so Audrey goes after him while Edward and Lionel check his coat. It turns out Christopher left his phone open on a call the whole time, and now everyone at the company knows where they are. The army suddenly arrives, knocks out and captures Audrey, but Lionel and Edward escape using the subway tunnels. They hide in an old abandoned garage, where they are attacked by a subspecies creature. Then Frankie arrives and shoots the creature, realizing his brother has become human again. He confesses he only transformed Edward before because he didn't want to see him die. He admits he made a mistake and now wants to help, but when Lionel approaches him, his thirst for blood takes over, and he jumps on him to bite him. Edward grabs him and pulls him off Lionel, ready to shoot his brother, when he notices something intriguing that makes him stop. Moments later, we see Edward willingly entering the company building, triggering the alarms with his human condition. Security catches him and takes him to Bromley's office, where Audrey is bleeding in a chair, and Bromley is drinking her blood. Edward tells him he regrets everything and wants to be a vampire again, leaving Audrey upset with his betrayal. Bromley shows him that they've finally found a substitute and that they no longer need Edward, calling him a coward. Edward retorts that Bromley is also a coward for not being able to transform his own daughter. Enraged by this word, Bromley bites Edward, but Edward doesn't care. In fact, this has been his plan all along. Suddenly Bromley starts transforming into a human again, and Edward recalls how Frankie also. He explains that drinking the blood of a treated vampire is the cure. Bromley presses an alarm to call security, and we cut to a bunch of army trucks arriving in the parking lot. As the soldiers leave their vehicles and approach the elevator, the doors open to reveal Bromley tied to a chair, causing the vampires to go into a frenzy and feed on him. Meanwhile, Audrey and Edward, now armed with guns they found there, descend the stairs and are about to leave the building when more soldiers arrive to block their way. The glass doors suddenly break when Frankie drives Lionel's car into it, getting in front of all the soldiers to save his brother. But reinforcements arrive quickly, and now they are surrounded. Frankie tells Edward to run and sacrifices himself, allowing all the soldiers to jump on him and devour him. Edward doesn't have time to mourn his death because a security guard takes Audrey, and he goes to rescue her. He follows them to the security room, where after some fighting, Edward manages to kill 2 vampire guards and helps Audrey kill the third. Then, they watch on the security cameras as the soldiers who fed on Frankie become human again, and the other vampire soldiers are now attacking them as well. A cycle of feeding and massacre occurs, and by the time Edward and Audrey return to the lobby, only a handful of human soldiers remain standing. Christopher appears and kills all the now human soldiers, claiming that there can be no cure. He's about to shoot them too when an arrow hits his chest and kills him. It was Lionel who came to help them. Audrey gives him a hug while Edward looks at his brother's body, and then the light of the rising sun slowly makes its way to them.